The mid to late 19th century brought a flowering of artistic and literary interest in exotic locales, places with unpronounceable names and characters just as foreign to 19th century audiences. Artists like Ingres, Delacroix, Géricault, composers like Delibes, Bizet, Rimsky-Korsakov in Russia, and later Giacomo Puccini were bringing their opera audiences closer to the Middle East, to India, China, Japan, even Ceylon. Giuseppe Verdi, the great operatic composer in Italy, was certainly not immune to this movement. In fact, by 1870, Verdi had written operas based in the Holy Land, in Peru, even ancient Babylon. But nothing so inspired late 19th century art and music as recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt, bringing a mystical, distant, and fascinating culture to life. This Romantic era movement was in part responsible for Verdi's Aida, arguably one of the most popular operas ever written. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. What better place to discuss Verdi's Aida than the ancient Egypt room in San Diego's Museum of Man here in Balboa Park? Let's review a moment. In past seasons, we've discussed Verdi's middle period, particularly the operas Il Trovatore and Un ballo in maschera. During this period of great activity for Verdi, he was also experiencing a lot of turbulence in his life, particularly backstage intrigues, constantly fighting with the censors, both state and ecclesiastical, and always trying to find the right singer for roles that were more and more demanding on the singer of the mid to late 19th century. This all made him want to return to his farm, Sant'Agata in Busseto, in northern Italy, to pick up the life of a simple farmer again. Friends, his publisher Giulio Ricordi, and certainly his wife Giuseppina were constantly trying to get him to write an opera again. But he was never terribly far from creativity. He was always revising earlier works, particularly Macbeth, Simone Boccanegra, and certainly Don Carlo, which pretty much preoccupied all of the late 1860s. Verdi at this point was in his mid-50s and less interested in public life, so it shouldn't surprise us from a purely human standpoint that he wanted to retire. Verdi had a number of disappointments during this period. Certainly his father's death is at the top of the list, but also the death of Antonio Barezzi. Barezzi was a resident of Busseto, Verdi's hometown, and he was also the father of Verdi's first wife. On top of all of this was the heartache that Verdi endured trying to produce Don Carlo for the Paris Opera. This is a very difficult experience for Verdi, and it left him bitter. But out of the Parisian experience came a relationship between Verdi and his wife with Camille Duloc, a French librettist and impresario, who was to become very important to this Aida story. Verdi depended on Duloc to send him plays and novels and stories, various scenarios, so that he could choose the subject for his next opera. As a matter of fact, Duloc kept sending him works by Victorien Sardou, the author of the play Tosca, which Puccini based his successful opera on. Now, what complicated matters in all of this is that early in the 1870s, Duloc became the general director of the Opéra Comique. The Opéra Comique, of course, was the site of the great failure of Bizet's Carmen. But it was also normally used for lighter fare, particularly comedies. Verdi had only written one comedy, Un giorno di regno. It was written during the fatal illness of his wife and his two children. And many of us know the story from his biography that he was attempting to write a comedy while his family was dying and outside the city of Milan was experiencing carnival. Comedy, in fact, eluded Verdi until the inspiration of Shakespeare's Falstaff character and Verdi's Falstaff was written during his final decade. But he was always looking for the right subject. He even turned to a French bonbon by the name of Frou Frou by Melodic and Aida, who were the librettists of Carmen. Thank goodness we've been spared Verdi's Frou Frou. But it's not unusual for a composer during that period to spend a great amount of time reading, plotting, and worrying about the story of his next opera. Opera was a very short distance to financial ruin. The wrong subject could be disastrous, as was the case of Carmen. But in 1870, Camille Dulloc sent Verdi a scenario on an Egyptian subject devised by the secretary of the Khedive, or viceroy of Egypt. He was a man responsible for some spectacular archaeological finds. His name, Auguste Mariette, the subject, Aida. Auguste Mariette was a fascinating individual. He was made famous in the late 19th century for his discovery of the Temple of Serapis and the tombs of the Apis bulls. He began his career, amazingly enough, as an Egyptologist at the Louvre in Paris in 1849. 2 years later, after his spectacular finds in Egypt, he was pressed into the service of the Khedive in Cairo, supervising all of the archaeological digs in Egypt. In hindsight, a really sensitive position for a foreigner. He also had some theatrical insight, as his scenario for Aida shows us. Luckily, his boss, the Khedive, had a great passion for European opera. In 1869, he began the construction of an opera house to celebrate or commemorate the digging of the Suez Canal. Through Mariette, his secretary, and Mariette's dear friend, Camille Dulloc, the Khedive approached Verdi for an ode or a hymn to celebrate the opening of the canal. Verdi said no. The Khedive pressed on. He said, well, then perhaps a new opera for the new opera house in Cairo. Verdi again said, no, I'm not interested. And they had to make do with a performance of Rigoletto. But the Khedive would not give up. Of course, all through this intrigue, Mariette had ulterior motives. First of all, of course, he wanted his scenario, Aida, to be turned into an opera by the greatest composer who ever lived. And he wanted the scenario put to text by the important French librettist Camille Dulloc. But he hadn't been in Paris for 20 years. He wanted to go back and supervise the production of Aida, make sure that all of the historical elements were correct and proper, like the costumes and the sets, and to visit his family. He hadn't seen them in so long. Well, after many false starts and many renunciations and many no's on Verdi's part, Dulloc finally sent Verdi the scenario by Mariette, but he introduced it as having been written by the Khedive himself, and only in passing did he mention that a famous Egyptologist had been involved. He added, if you're not interested, perhaps I'll send it to, Richard Wagner. Well, maybe that's what did it. But Verdi finally, after reading the scenario and struck with the simplicity of the plot and the exotic nature of the locale and of the background, he finally said yes. Mariette finally did get back to Paris, but it's a rather sad story. In early 1870, France went to war with Prussia, and Paris was under siege during the entire time that Mariette was visiting his home. In fact, it was under siege during the entire time of the progress of the production of Aida, which was being built in Paris. Much of it then was interrupted, and Mariette was stuck in a war-torn area. The premiere was put off from January until December of 1871. Verdi turned Mariette's scenario over to the Italian librettist Antonio Ghislanzoni, who worked very closely with Verdi and his constant collaborator, his wife. And after many delays, Aida was finally premiered at the Cairo Opera House on Christmas Eve 1871. It was an immediate success with the public, but not, alas, with the critics. Critics saw Verdi's Aida as a step backwards, as an opera that used old-fashioned structures and forms. But it was never a failure with the audience. And it was a great success at La Scala in early 1872, where the composer himself supervised the production and coached the singers. Verdi did not want to travel by boat all the way to Cairo, so he missed the world premiere. Verdi, of course, was disturbed by some of the criticism, but he continued to work on various productions of Aida, 3 more productions, in fact, in other Italian cities, and until within 3 years, Aida had been seen all over Europe, New York City, and South America. Within a decade, Aida was among the most actively produced operas in history. The story of Aida centers around the character of Radames. Now, he's an Egyptian general who's carrying on a campaign against the Ethiopians. Radames also happens to be in love with a young Ethiopian prisoner whose name is Aida. She is the handmaiden of the Egyptian princess Amneris. Amneris loves Radames, and she is distraught to discover early on in the opera that the rival for that love is her own servant, Aida. What Amneris is not aware of is that her servant, Aida, is herself a princess, daughter of the king of Ethiopia, Amonasro. Radames returns triumphant from battle with captives from Ethiopia, including Amonasro, the king, much to the distress of Aida. As a reward for Radames' military success, the pharaoh gives him his daughter's hand in marriage, and Aida's father is kept a prisoner in the palace. In an intense scene, a wonderful duet between father and daughter, Amonasro bullies Aida into getting Radames to reveal a vital military secret. For this treason, Radames is sentenced to be buried alive, and at the end of the opera, he suddenly realizes in the quiet of the tomb that Aida has joined him. As they sing a final love duet, Amneris appears in a chamber above the tomb, kneeling on the stone which seals it, and prays to the gods for the redemption of Radames' soul. To speak a little bit more about Aida and the context in the late 19th century that it appeared, I thought that I'd bring in my dear friend, composer Myron Fink, to discuss Verdi and particularly this opera. Myron, welcome.
Thank you very much.
First question is this. Aida was created during a time when European composers were looking for more exotic territory anyway, and of course this piece is set in ancient Egypt. Tell us a little bit about that, the atmosphere of composition in the late 19th century.
Well, of course, the search for what they called exoticism goes back to the voyages of discovery, actually, and the entrance of Western culture into contact with Japan, China, and so on. There was a craze in the 18th century for chinoiserie, things from the Orient, all over Europe. And also another exotic country. It seems very strange to talk about an exotic country such as Spain, but to the European composers, Spain was indeed an exotic country.
Hence
so one of the great examples of that was Carmen, when you think about that. Also, there was the whole influx of music from Eastern Europe, which started with Frédéric Chopin, a lovely French name, but of course he was born in Poland. And so composers from the East, Russia, Glinka, for example, and their contact with the East made a kind of atmosphere in which composers were searching for different colors, different kinds of sounds that were not native Western European culture. A perfect example, of course, is Madame Butterfly. when you think about it,
of
right?
course.
Another one is Turandot of Puccini of China. There were others, for example, there is an opera called L'Africaine by Meyerbeer, great grand opera, and it's the story of Vasco da Gama, and of course his entrance into India.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a number of pieces like this in which a kind of oriental color appears. A very famous one that most listeners perhaps will know comes from a Rimsky-Korsakov opera, The Song of India.
Right.
Well,
right.
And so there are a large number of pieces which have this exotic flavor.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that the composers were looking for different colors.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you mean by that? And how does Verdi capture the color of ancient Egypt or this exotic territory in his music?
Well, how technical do I get? Because this does require a little thought. Western music, as you very well know, of course, has the major scale and the minor scale. But there are older forms of scales called modes.
Right.
Right? And one of them is the Phrygian mode, which Verdi uses in Aida.
Throughout Aida?
Not throughout, but in certain portions. For example, the scene in the temple,
Mm-hmm.
the song of the priestess that comes down, is pure Phrygian mode. Mm-hmm. And the favorite interval, I remember when I was a student practicing a scale called the Hungarian scale, another exotic country, right? And that had that famous interval of the augmented second in it. Mm-hmm. And this to Western ears sounded very peculiar. Verdi uses this in Aida a good deal. There's also a constant shift between major and minor that goes on throughout this in a very...
That is throughout the opera.
Absolutely
it's very
throughout the
noticeable.
opera.
Yeah.
Verdi always paid particular attention to what he called the tinta, the color of a score. And that shift between major and minor is Aida from the word go, from the first note to the last note.
Mm-hmm. Let's move to the requirements necessary for performing, for casting this piece. Of course, it calls for a soprano, a mezzo-soprano, and a tenor, but of rather heroic proportions.
Absolutely. One must remember, this is a grand opera. Verdi always had a kind of funny attitude towards grand opera, but in Aida, he made grand opera his own. This is the grandest of the grand operas, if you will. And the characters are, as you say, heroic. So that, but it's not just the fact that they have to be dramatic, big voices. They must also be lyrical, beautiful voices. Not every big voice is a beautiful voice.
Right.
And so the requirements are of, particularly for Amneris, the mezzo-soprano. She's really a dramatic soprano, even though mezzos try this role. She has to go high, she has to go low, and she has scenes of such dramatic intensity that it's very easy for the soprano to tear a voice apart. Mm-hmm. The same thing is true of the Aida, the same thing is true of the tenor, of Radames. And so it's a role where you have to have it. You can't say, oh, this is a great dramatic role, I'd love to sing it. You got to have the voice to do it.
So consequently, Aida is a terrifically difficult opera to cast.
Very hard, very, very difficult. Right.
Myron, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nick.
Those are the first two measures of the orchestral prelude to Verdi's Aida. And every time I hear the beginning of this opera, I'm never quite sure where I am. It leaves me hanging because the violins are playing very quietly all by themselves with no accompaniment, almost as high as they can possibly be. We don't know what key we're in, where we are harmonically. It almost doesn't sound like Verdi until the third full measure, another voice, lower violins come in and give us a little bit of harmony. Then we can begin to tell where we are. But it's still very ethereal and extremely mysterious. Now what's happening here is that Verdi is playing with the difference between major and minor. When we hear that second voice enter, we know we're in a minor mode, but we're still not quite sure about what's going on. Until here. and we have a major chord. Well, I think the point here is that Verdi wants us to feel like the rug is being pulled out from underneath our feet. He wants us to realize that we're in new territory, not only in terms of a storyline about ancient Egypt, something he had never really attempted before, but also in terms musically. This prelude is probably the most highly chromatic, the most dissonant thing that Verdi had ever written up to that point. He wanted us to feel uncomfortable, somewhat disjointed, not with our feet not really firmly on the ground, so that we'll be surprised and ready for this wonderfully mysterious story. There are so many interesting things about Verdi's score that we really don't have enough time to cover them all. But let me point out a couple of interesting elements. First of all, the attempt by Verdi to give the score a kind of exotic flavor. Now, at the point that Verdi was writing, there was no such thing as ancient Egyptian music, although a little bit of it has been unearthed since then. But he tried to give the music an exotic flavor in various ways. Here, let me show you the High Priestess's song at the beginning of Scene 2. It's accompanied by harps. That's just about as exotic as Verdi ever gets in his operas, and it's a wonderful flavor. Also in the ballet music during the triumphal scene, we have moments of exoticism. If Verdi had written this as if it were a Western composer writing it, it might have come out something like this. But with the alteration of one note, it sounds very Far Eastern. It sounds quite exotic. Of course, the most wonderful thing about Verdi's score is the huge amount of gorgeous melodic writing. The melodies are absolutely exquisite. None more exquisite than the very last melody that we hear at the end of the opera, the duet, O Terra Dio. It's built on the leap of a major seventh. Now here is that interval. It's extremely dissonant. Of course, Verdi doesn't use it quite that way. The melody is this. Only Verdi could take such a dissonant interval, such a wide leap of melody, and turn it into something gorgeous. There are at least 40 great recordings of Aida out there, and I'm only going to look at about 4 or 5 of them. You surely have your favorite recording, but here are some of mine. Certainly the Aida of Leontine Price with the Radames sung by John Vickers is a wonderful recording from London, conducted by Sir Georg Scholti. There is also the Aida with Birgit Nilsson in a role that she was certainly not known for, that being Aida, and her Radames was the great Franco Corelli. This was conducted by a very young Zubin Mehta. There's an older recording with Zinka Milanov as Aida and the incomparable Jussi Björling as Radames. This, too, is an extremely important recording and a beautiful one to have for your collection. One of the best contemporary recordings of Aida is with another soprano who was not particularly known as an Aida, but recorded it beautifully. That was Montserrat Caballé. Her Radames was Placido Domingo in a recording conducted by Riccardo Muti. But one of my very favorite recordings of Aida comes from 1939. The conductor, Sir Thomas Beecham, the Aida, Maria Caniglia, the Radames, Beniamino Gilli. This is a great recording. The sound is terrible, as you would imagine, but the recording, the performance is exquisite. I'm sure out of these or many of the others that are available, you'll be able to find an Aida that you love. Verdi's Aida, an opera with a great dramatic story, and an opera that shows modern audiences what 19th century audiences were interested in. At the center of that, exotic locales and ancient Egypt. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.